everyone, and welcome to another episode of AppSec 101. My name is Andrew Garrett, and I am a Senior Product Marketing Manager here at Fortify by OpenText. And I am pleased to be joined today by Joanna Qvarnström, who is our Director of Product Marketing for Debricked, one of the newest players in the software composition analysis space. I'm very happy to have you on, Joanna. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks. I am super happy to be here as well. A lot of fun.
Yeah, it should be great. And just to give our viewers a little background on you, Joanna, so you're based in Malmö, Sweden, and your background is primarily in marketing, and you previously spent some years writing for a crypto blog before getting interested in cybersecurity. And back in 2019, you started as one of the first employees at Debricked back then, which was a tiny startup at the time. And since then, your passion for open source security has grown, and now you lead the marketing function for Debricked, which is now a part of Fortify and OpenText security. So it's been a busy last few years at Debricked, it sounds like.
It definitely has.
Yeah, that's great. Well, today our topic is software composition analysis. And so for our viewers who are maybe new to the space, could you give us an explanation of what is software composition analysis and why is it important?
Of course. So software composition analysis it's typically abbreviated as SCA. So I will be saying SCA a lot, just so I don't need to say the whole thing, right? But it's really what the word suggests. So it's analyzing the components of your software. And typically what it's mostly used for these days is analyzing the open source that you have in your application. Because that is usually the largest part. So oftentimes over 80% of an application consists of open source. So that's a lot. So that makes it kind of obvious as to why you need to keep track of that. So what is open source is maybe also something we should cover quickly. So open source is software which is licensed as open source. And that means that it's basically code that's free and open for everybody to use. And it's a really, really great thing. But of course, there are some risks to it, right? So if we then know that 80% of your code is open source, but that's actually only the code that you've brought in yourself. There's also something called indirect dependencies, so indirect open source dependencies, and those are the dependencies of which your open source depends on. So let's say you bring in project A, and that depends on project B, which you don't have. But if project B gets a vulnerability, you're still vulnerable due to having that project A, which, like I said, it depends on project B, right? And as you probably understand, this scales like crazy, and it's pretty much impossible to keep track of manually because one open source project can have hundreds or thousands of dependencies. So simply, yeah, you need a tool to take care of this, and that is exactly what an SCA tool does.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up how prevalent open source projects are, because I feel like nowadays it's very rare to find any sort of software that doesn't contain, at least a portion of open source code that is, pulled from an open source library. And you mentioned, 80%. I've seen some estimates, higher than that, 90%, 95%. But I think the thing that we're seeing is, it's inevitable. You're going to see you're going to see open source code combined with your custom code. So you need to be prepared. You need to have tools in place. You need to have SAST, but you also need to combine that with SCA to get that 360-degree view of custom code and open source code. Well, let's talk about some of the risks that SCA can mitigate. So, for those who have a software composition analysis tool in place, what are some of the risks that they could potentially avoid?
So firstly, maybe one of the most well-known parts of this is, of course, security vulnerabilities, because that's something that most development teams, most organizations know that this is something they need to keep track of. So that's probably the main thing, that the main risk, if you will. We also have the license compliance of the open source that you're using. So open source, it is determined by the license, but there are a ton of different licenses that actually say what you can do with the code. So for example, there are some licenses that will state that any code that is using code with this license, the specific license, has to be published as open source. And that's, of course, not something you want to do if you're a commercial company developing proprietary code and products, right? You don't want to publish your code to the world. So that's something you definitely need to keep track of. And then thirdly, you need to keep track of the health of the community of the open source that you're using. And this is perhaps not as well known as a risk. So what does this mean? This means that, for example, there are millions of open source projects out there that are maintained by just 1 or 2 people. So then what happens if they stop maintaining it when you've already based some of your code on that project? That's not a great situation to be in. It can be very, very expensive. You have to switch it out, or you have to spend a lot of development time to maintain it yourself. It can cause a lot of issues. So choosing a project with a thriving, active community, of course, this is less likely to happen. So those are the 3 main risks that you need to keep track of. There's, of course, a lot more, but these are the main ones, I would say.
Okay, yeah, I've heard that term, community health. You hear that. Could you maybe expound on that a little bit more? How do you know the status of, the health or the maintenance of an open source project? Is there a way to kind of know that just by looking at the open source project?
I mean, that's a great question, because it's a challenge, right? Because you don't want to be spending hours and hours on GitHub having to do this research by yourself. Like, that's very, very time consuming. The way that we've solved this problem at Debricked is we have this term, which is open source health, which is something that we have created within Debricked, which is basically that we look at all of this data on GitHub. So we have cloned over 4 million open source projects, and basically derived metrics from that, which gives a clue to the community, the popularity, and the security practices of projects. So by searching for open source in Open Source Select, you can get hints on if you're choosing something which is going to be good or bad, community-wise. So that's
Okay.
how we solve it. Of course, you can do it manually, but yeah, it would be very time consuming, I would say.
Yeah, it'll take a lot of time and effort for sure.
Exactly.
Okay, well, that sounds like a best practice then, which is a good segue into our next topic, which is what are some best practices for people using SCA tools?
So starting from the beginning, the very beginning of kind of the workflow of an SEA tool, I would say that scanning continuously. So this is something that we see with customers who aren't used to using SEA as much. They might use a tool to scan every once in a while, once per quarter, pull out the results in a report, get left on a desk somewhere. It's not ideal. The best way to do it that we see is actually plugging the tool into your CI/CD and scan at every commit, because then you can really ensure that no risk gets in there, and you're in control from the very beginning. So definitely scanning continuously. It's very, very important. So secondly, and that's kind of a continuation to the previous point, would be making sure that you integrate your SEA practices with your DevOps practices that you already have in place, right? So the first step is, like I already talked about, integrating to your CI/CD, making sure that you run scans at every commit, but then also making sure that your developers are actually using the tool and that there are processes in place to make the most of the tool. Because otherwise you've paid a lot of money for a tool that no one is really using. It's not the best situation. So for example, that can be setting up automated rules that fail a pipeline when a risk is trying to be introduced. Taking advantage of automated fixes, making sure to do that early on in the development process, not leaving it for the end there. So that you make sure that you never get stuck with a ton of security bugs or compliance issues that are going to slow you down. So really having a process for that throughout the development process.
I think that's a great point, because especially as your security team scales, having that automation in place can be really helpful. It's not all up to you to have to be vigilant and watching and doing all this manual auditing and reviews. So it can be a big help to have these automation rules in place that could catch things that you otherwise might not catch on your own.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then thirdly, and I think I've touched a little bit upon this already, but I'm going to repeat it because I think it's one of the most important aspects, and that is choose a tool that is easy to use. So we have a saying at Debricked, and that is the best security tool is the one that your developers or your organization actually uses. Because like I said before, you buy this expensive tool, it sits there, you don't get started with it, no one is really using it, the adoption rate is just too low, and you won't get the outcomes that you were looking for when you got it in the first place. And I think the most important people here are probably your developers, because most likely they're the ones who are going to be working with this on a day-to-day basis. So let the people who will spend the most time interacting with the tool kind of be the judge if this is something that they want to work with on a day-to-day basis, and make sure to choose wisely. So not just looking at functionality there, but also on usability and user experience.
Yeah, I like that a lot. It reminded me of, there's a phrase that you sometimes hear in sports that goes, the best ability is availability. And, it means you might have, if you're thinking of a star player on a team, if he's always injured and he's not able to contribute to the team, how valuable is he really if he's not contributing? So I think that applies here as well. Like you said, you may have the best, most expensive tools in place, but if no one's using them, they're not doing any good, just sitting on the sidelines, so to speak. So Debricked, I've seen the Debricked UI, and it's very user friendly, very intuitive. I know when Fortify made the decision to acquire Debricked, I know that played a big part, was the usability, the ease of use. It's very easy to get started, and people can test drive with the free trial, get a feel for it. And so that's really probably the most important thing to consider when you're thinking about SCA tools and open source security. Is this something I'm able to use? Is this something we can roll out with our developers and have them understand it? So that's a great point.
Yeah, and I think in this day and age, and especially since we know that developers love using open source, I think that making sure that they also have a tool that makes it easier for them to make better decisions and to be more secure, but one that they actually like. I think that's really crucial. Definitely.
Well, Joanna, now I think would be a good time for us to talk about what resources are out there to help teams get started with SCA.
I mean, of course, I have to say that Debricked is a great place to get started. Like we've touched on a little bit before. I mean, It's really very, very easy to use and easy to understand, both for developers, people in DevSecOps, security people, and even managers, I would say. We spent a lot of time on perfecting the user experience, on working on the UI. So like a really great place to get started is heading over to debricked.com and starting a free trial. We also have a ton of great resources on SCA best practices, how to get started, what to consider when you're setting up your open source security strategy, tons of tutorials and other good stuff. Debricked makes open source security really easy to understand. So you really don't need to be an expert going into it. You can, with a few steps, come a really long way, I would say.
Yeah, and that's key, is finding a tool that can help you get started on the path. And like you said, Debricked, it's a great way to get started. Very easy transition for people. And I guess my next question would be for people that have settled on an SCA tool, or maybe they're evaluating a few different ones. Could you give us some tips on what to look for in an SCA tool?
First of all, I'm repeating myself, but a tool that's easy to use, easy to understand, and that your developers like and are happy to use every single day. So that's one thing, and really making sure as well that it fits in with your developers' workflow, because the last thing you want is a tool that bothers your developers. You want one which is either seamless enough that it doesn't bother them, or maybe they even enjoy using. So that's, of course, one thing. The next thing would probably be to making sure that the tool has proper automation capabilities, because you really want to make sure that the tool works for you and not the other way around. Because again, you're paying a lot of dollars for a tool. You want it to help you, to make your life easier. That's really, really key here. The next thing would probably be actionability. So making sure that when the tool presents you with data, because a lot of what you're going to see in an SCA tool is going to be data, making sure that it's actionable, because otherwise it's data. You won't know what to do with it. You won't really know, like, how is this data helping me become more secure, right? So that's also making sure that the tool actually presents actionable data and something where you get a hint as to what do I do with this information and how do I get better from this. And then finally, I would say the ability to be proactive. And that sounds, I mean, that's a broad statement, very, very broad statement. But I think one of the things that are most important about this is having an open source security strategy, which isn't just about reacting to risk, because a lot of the times, a vulnerability appears, we react to it. And that's just this never ending story, this never ending cycle, right? But having some sort of capability where you focus on how to become more secure as you go and how to be proactive in that and building that strong foundation. So taking that approach to it is something I would also look for.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I could put a plug in for Fortify as well, Fortify can really complete this full picture of AppSec. You mentioned, the importance of the data that you're looking at, and Debricked brings that SCA data to the table. And then with Fortify, you have your SAST, so you can, with your static analysis of your custom code, you can then combine it with the data from Debricked for that full picture. And then, you also have Fortify Web Inspect, which is our dynamic analysis solution. So you have SCA, you have SAST, you have DAST, and now you're really getting a full picture of the health, of the security of your code. And ultimately, great code is secure code. And that's the ultimate goal for developers, for security teams. We want to secure our software supply chains, and deliver software to our customers that is secure and that is high quality. And I think that's the goal for all of us. So, well, Joanna, we're getting a little short on time now, but before we wrap up, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to leave with us today?
Well, I would like to just make it super clear that Debricked has a very generous free offering. So we offer both the kind of classic SCA offering that we have, a very nice free tier on our website, and also Open Source Select that I touched on a little bit earlier. So when you're searching for open source, you can hop into Open Source Select, search for any open source package in the world, and really dive deep into that. So feel free to try it out, and hopefully it's something that you like.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks, Joanna. Thank you so much for taking some time. I know it's the end of the day for you there in Sweden. It's the beginning of the day for me here in the States. But I appreciate you taking some time, and I know you said your English starts to fade at the end of the day, but I didn't
Yes.
notice that at all. So,
That's good.
well, yeah, thanks again. And to our viewers, I hope you enjoyed this episode today. I hope you learned something about software composition analysis and open source security. If you haven't already subscribed to Fortify Unplugged, I encourage you to do so. Please leave a comment and a like down below. And please stay tuned for more episodes of AppSec 101. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.